This is Taiwan as depicted in the famous Kangxi Atlas of the Qing Imperial territories. For a long time, the way Taiwan was drawn on Qing Imperial maps profoundly shaped how other countries understood the island's relationship with the empire. For example, this map of Fujian Province, created by the French geographer in the early 18th century, was essentially based on the Kangxi Atlas. Many of the disputes that broke out in the waters around Taiwan during the late 19th century were directly related to the way Taiwan was portrayed and perceived in such maps. In today's video, we are going to explore one key question. Why did the last dynasty of China, the Qing Dynasty, depict Taiwan this way? I would like to take a moment to thank the Simpson Center and the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Washington for their generous support for this series. I especially recommend subscribing to UW's Taiwan Studies program YouTube channel. There, you will find a wide range of lectures, panels, and events offering fresh perspective on Taiwan studies from North America. Very grateful to the Simpson Center and Taiwan Studies for their support. To answer this question, we must first ask, how did the Qing Empire bring Taiwan into its territorial domain? At the heart of this issue is a deeper question. What exactly did it mean to be incorporated into the empire? After the fall of the Ming loyalist regime in Taiwan, known as the Kingdom of Dongning, a fierce debate broke out in the Qing court in Beijing. This was the famous controversy over the retention of Taiwan. In other words, officials were deeply divided on whether the Qing should maintain actual control over the island. In 1683, the Qing Admiral Shilang led the Fujian Navy to decisive victory over the Ming loyalists at Penghu. Prince Zheng Keshuang surrendered shortly afterward. Qing officials celebrated the conquest as an elimination of a major threat across the sea and petitioned the Kangxi Emperor to adopt an honorific title for this victory and to formally incorporate Taiwan into the empire's territory. But Kangxi flatly rejected the proposal. As recorded in the veritable records of the Qing Dynasty, he reportedly said, "Taiwan is an overseas foreign place and has little to do with us in the past because it resisted imperial rule and disturbed our coastal populations. I order troops to suppress it. Even if Taiwan does not pledge allegiance, it would not have posed any real threat to our governance." In the end, the emperor rejected his officials' proposals. He declined to use his honorific title and refused to treat the conquest of Taiwan as a formal expansion of the imperial territory. Interestingly, the officials submitted yet another proposal, saying even though Taiwan is overseas, it's being occupied by the pirates for years. They've been using the natural terrain to harass our coastal people. Thanks to your majesty's leadership, we've managed to both pacify and conquer them, and now the pirates have surrendered to our dynasty. Your majesty's virtuous power reaching overseas is truly an unprecedented achievement. We know full well that your majesty prefers simplicity and doesn't like flashy press, but honestly, your accomplishments outshine all the previous emperors. If we don't give you an honorary title, how else can we express the people's admiration? The flattery was completely over the top and cheesy. Clearly, they just wanted Taiwan to be officially included in the empire's territory. But what's even more interesting is that Emperor Kangxi turned them down once more. He said, "Pirates are like a skin rash, and Taiwan is just a tiny speck of land. Gaining it is like gaining nothing, and losing it wouldn't be a loss either." So Emperor Kangxi rejected the request to incorporate Taiwan into the imperial territory not just once but twice. As I've mentioned in my video about Sakhalin, when it came to the rulers of the Great Qing, their top concern was always the cost of governance. If a remote region was going to be a sinking money pit, the Qing rulers simply had no incentive to control it. Let's rewind to the year of 1684. Think about what China looked like at the time. It was in a rough shape. Just 3 years earlier, in 1684, the Qing had only just wrapped up the revolt of the three feudatories, a nearly decade-long civil war. Meanwhile, to the north border, Russia was eyeing the Heilongjiang region in Manchuria with a growing interest, and in the northwest, the Jungar Mongols had invaded the kingdom of Yarkand, present-day southern Xinjiang, bringing the entire regions under its control and posing a direct threat to the Qing defenses business in the area. China was going through a seriously turbulent time, fires to put out everywhere and money bleeding from all sides. From Emperor Kangxi's point of view, the court simply didn't have the energy or resources to spend a fortune governing some tiny little island on the southeastern edge of the empire. And yet, even after Kangxi had twice turned down proposals to formally incorporate Taiwan, the official kept petitioning. The most persistent and influential voice among them was none other than the General Shi Lang, the commander who had led the campaign to invade Taiwan in the first place. Shi Lang submitted a memorial titled "A Humble Petition on Whether to Abandon or Retain Taiwan." You can actually read the full documents in Chinese for free on Wikisource, so we won't go into all the details here. But here's the core arguments. Though Taiwan is made up of many islands and lies overseas, it directly concerns the security of our 4 crucial provinces. Those 4 provinces refer to Fujian, Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu, aka the financial heartlands of the Qing Empire. Shi Lang agreed that yes, Taiwan was small and remote, but if some maritime power were to occupy it again in the future, it could pose a real threat to those key coastal provinces and thus their tax revenues. So, from a defense perspective, Shi Lang argued, even if it meant running a deficit, the Great Qing should bring Taiwan into the imperial domain. Now, let's be clear, Shi Lang was definitely not a patriotic idealist. After leading the Qing army to Taiwan, Shi began quietly seizing developed farmland from the Zhen regime. In fact, there's a surviving receipt from the late 19th century showing that locals were still paying land rent to the Shi family. This rent was even named Lodge Rent of the Shi. So, from the late 1600s well into the late 1800s, the Shi clan remained one of the Taiwan's largest landowners. What this tells us is that those early Fujianese colonial settlers who came to Taiwan during the early Qing had a complex motive. The history here is a bit complicated, so we will just leave it there for now. Let's say, for personal gain or not, Shi Lang's proposal did strike a chord with the emperor and the top Manchu officials. By that point, Taiwan's strategic value was becoming more obvious, especially with the rise of maritime trade. After about 10 months of debates in Beijing, Emperor Kangxi finally made a decision: Taiwan would be brought under imperial control as part of Fujian Province. But the money problem still loomed at large. How was the empire supposed to afford governing this new territory? To make matters worse, the Han Chinese population in Taiwan had taken a serious hit, especially after Zheng Jin and his men had participated in the revolts of the 3 feudatories. Taiwan had been continuously engaging in several violent conflicts. The first magistrate of Zhuluo County of Taiwan, which is modern-day Jiayi, Ji Qiguang, made a telling observation at the time. Once you subtract soldiers, refugees, and Zheng regime officials and their families, Taiwan is basically just scattered people on desolate land. According to Qing records from the 1685, the total Han population, including both men and women, barely exceeded 30,000. Since the government only taxed adult men, which meant fewer than 16,000 taxable individuals, so revenue was slim. To maintain order, the empire had no choice but to send in officials and troops, mostly just to keep potential Han rebellions in check. But Taiwan couldn't pay for its own military, so Fujian and other nearby provinces had to cough up the funds. In the eyes of the Qing court, the strategic goal was simple: rule Taiwan as cheaply as possible, with just enough political resources to prevent Han uprising. This is why Qing administrators only bothered to govern areas where Han people had settled. The indigenous territory, the so-called barbarian lands, weren't really of much governing interest to them. But this hands-off, provincial-based approach created new problems. If the Qing government didn't actively govern the indigenous regions, it effectively meant those large swaths of land had no imperial presence, with no governing official and no troops. Naturally, some Han settlers started sneaking into the barbarian lands to farm, knowing the empire wouldn't collect taxes there. But from the Qing perspective, that was most definitely unacceptable. Many of these Han settlers had a history of rebellion. Letting them spray into regions outside official control was like handing match to the arsonist. So the problem became urgent. How do you draw a line between where Han settler can go and where indigenous lands begin? Retrospectively, the Qing courts wasn't wrong to worry. Almost every major rebellion during the Qing era started near these Han indigenous border zones. The Zhu Yigui uprising exactly that, the Lin Shuangwen rebellion same story. The Qing government realized it needed to establish a clear boundary, one that marked where the Han colonization's border ended and where the indigenous territory began. The Qing dynasty was a famously form of governing in zones. Across the empire where Manchuria, Mongolia, and former Ming territory met, the Qing drew clear boundaries called Willow Palisade to stop Han Chinese and Mongols from excavating in Manchu homeland. Taiwan was no exception. There they established the so-called barbarian border, which separated Han settler from the indigenous land. But this border wasn't even invented by the Manchu. It actually dates back to the Ming Zheng period when Zheng Chenggong's regions ruled Taiwan and was originally called the Earthen Oxen Dish. Why the name Earthen Oxen? Well, during that era, Fujianese settlers were constantly clashing with indigenous groups over farmlands and resources. To mark the limits of the Han settlements, colonists piled up large dirt mounds. They were so big they looked like oxen, hence the name Earthen Oxen. Let's say it wasn't until the Qing took over that these boundaries became part of the systematic state-managed frontier policy. During the Kangxi reign, the government did map out the boundaries, but enforcement was loose. Still, the imperial stance was clear. They only governed Han settlers and the Cook barbarians. That's what they called the assimilated indigenous groups. Toward the end of the Kangxi reign, some officials even suggested skipping segregation altogether. Why not just assimilate the raw barbarian? One document captures this mindset perfectly. It's a memorial from Manchu official Juelu Manbao, the governor of Fujian and Zhejiang. He writes, since Taiwan was brought into the empire, the 12th Cook barbarian village in Fengshan and the 34th in Zhulo had lived under imperial grasp for decades. They have become prosperous, peaceful, and more culturally refined. The remaining raw barbarian who would always live in remote valleys now see how well the assimilated live, paying minimal taxes with bountiful crops, farming safely under the emperor's reign. Naturally, the raw barbarian are thrilled and want to partake in this prosperous imperial order. We can know for sure whether the indigenous communities actually wanted to be included in the Qing rule, but what is clear is that some of them were, at least on paper, added to the tax rolls. And for the government, this was news worth reporting to the emperor. He continues, let the Cook barbarian keep trading as usual, but soldiers and commoners from the interior must not enter barbarian territory without permission, nor use patrols as an excuse to harass. The raw barbarian newly added to the maps don't go poking around their living areas. Let them live peacefully, following their nature, and enjoy the blessing of the imperial era. Here's the kicker. That phrase, added to the maps, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. This memorial was written in the 1760s, not in 1683 when Taiwan was first annexed. That's over 30 years later. And yet, even then, Juelu Manbao treated the indigenous tribes as outsiders in the process of being included into the empire. To him, they weren't parts of the original Qing territory. In other words, lands beyond the barbarian boundary where the assimilated groups live weren't fully considered imperial domain. And Juelu Manbao wasn't alone in this thinking. Similar ideas were common in the 18th and 19th century. For example, a Fujian scholar named Guo Qiyuan wrote an essay titled On the Defense of Taiwan. He described the situation like this. Taiwan is a remote island capable of growing grains, connected north to Liaodong and south to Zhangzhou and Quanzhou. The island spans over 3,000 Chinese meters, but only about 2,000 meters are parts of the Qing territory. The rest is inhabited by raw barbarian. Now, Guo was not some high-ranking official. He was just a scholar from Ming County of Fujian with no imperial rankings. But his view mirrored that of the Governor General Juelu Manbao, that land beyond the Han indigenous border was not fully within the Qing domain. Still, not everyone agreed. A different source showed up in the revised gazetteer of Taiwan Prefecture, which you can actually find online if you want to dive into the text yourself. It states, Taiwan, though remote and overseas, was originally inhabited by barbarians. Since joining the Imperial territory, there has been a distinction between raw and cook. The raw ones live deep in the mountains but have recently become accepted a cultural instruction. The cook barbarian pay taxes and perform labor duty. They are part of the registered population. This view is exact opposite of Manbao and Guoqiyuan's. Here, all the indigenous lands are considered part of the Qing Empire, and the only difference is whether the tribes are taxed and conscripted or not. To our 21st century nation-state conditioned minds, the two perspectives feel totally contradictory. But in the logic of the empire, they weren't. Both were parts of a flexible, pragmatic policy framework. To some level, the Qing did claim sovereignty over the whole island of Taiwan. In practice, administrative authority only reached the area external to the barbarian border. That is, Han settlements and some annexed indigenous villages. So why did the Qing draw the maps that way? At this point in the video, the answer might be obvious. The Taiwan that's being depicted, only the western half, matches precisely the area Qing government actually controlled. These administrative borders not only indicated resources were only allocated to the west, they also reflected that Kangxi administration simply didn't have the manpower or resources to send people beyond the border for geographical survey. Let's take a look at this map. This is probably one of the earliest maps of Taiwan that Qing court got its hands on. Drawn sometime after the Treaty of Nerchinsk was signed with Russia in 1689. In fact, this map was bound together with three other maps of the empire's northern frontiers. One of Russia, then called Luocha, one of the Aiguan region in Manchuria, and one of Mongolia. Now, looking at this map of Taiwan, down here is Lower Danshui, which refers to the area around the modern-day Kaohsiung and Pingtung. Then we see the Fengshan, now part of Kaohsiung. And moving up, we get Cikan, which is today's Tainan. Not far after that are Danshui, Bali, and then Jilong. So what does this illustration tell us? Well, clearly this wasn't based on precise surveying. It's more of a rough sketch. A kind of a diagram that simply shows the span of a Han settler control from the southern to the northern tip of the island. Up at the top of the map, you can also see a range of mountains. Kuilei Mountains, which is today's Beidawu Mountain in Pingtung, stretching all the way up to Guilong Mountain, now known as Qilong Mountain. What's the message here? In some sense, it suggests that whatever lies beyond those mountains is not considered a part of Taiwan. Similar calligraphic threads are also reflected in another famous map, the Kangxi Taiwan Atlas held by the National Taiwan Museum. It was drawn around the same period, maybe a little later. Judging by how much more detailed it is, it clearly involved more serious surveying work. Here's Qilong. Then, going south, we see the once mighty indigenous kingdom of Dadu, which was in what today's Taichung. As we move further down, this map offers far more detail than the earlier one, showing mountain positions, river path, and the layout of settlements. Here's the Zhuluo County with coastal military camps clearly marked. Then here's the Taiwan County, which refers to the area around today's Tainan city. In fact, this map even shows the layouts of Tainan's streets and significant landmarks. For example, the Wenmiao here refers to the Confucius Temple still standing in Tainan. Keep going south and there's a Fengshan in Kaohsiung. And then we are back to the lower Danshui in Pingtung. Yes, the same one from the earlier map. Above it is a mountain labeled Fenci Mountain, or literally Poop Pond Mountain. I have absolutely no idea which mountain it is. If anyone watching happens to know, please drop it in the comments, because next time I'm in the area, I'll have to check it out. In addition to its silly name next to it, the several other mountains the map include a note, no human traces. The same phrase appear on mountains to the north and south. So what does that entail? Did the mapmaker genuinely not know that there are indigenous people living beyond those peaks? Honestly, I think they knew, but from the perspective of Han settler cartographers, the raw barbarian living beyond the border didn't come as human, and if they weren't considered human, then naturally the places they live didn't count as real places, so they simply got left off the map. In the earlier map, it's even more extreme. Behind the mountain, just the sea. The entire eastern half of the island was erased. The map visualizes 17th and early 18th century Han colonial cultural chauvinism. But on the other hand, there were also very practical reasons for maps turning out this way. Remember the earlier points about the cost of governance? Lack of funding, manpower, and resources meant no one could be sent out to the back mountains of Taiwan to do technical survey. And this situation didn't exactly improve in the Kangxi Atlas, which we look at the start of the video. Zooming in on this map, you will see that, like the other, it only includes the western half of Taiwan. Despite being one of the world's best maps at the time, thanks to its inclusion of longitude and latitude, it offers a little more when it comes to Taiwan. How many people did the Qing court send to survey the island? Historical records say 1 Jesuit missionary and 1 Qing official for the south. Just 1 Qing official for the north. That's it. So what does that mean? Just a few men were expected to map the entire island without any military protection beyond the boundary. There was no way to accurately map Taiwan's eastern half with such a little resources. These cartographical blanks reveal a harsh truth. The Qing could not really control eastern Taiwan. The island wasn't the only blank spot. Another big one was Guizhou. Now, most of us think of Guizhou as one of the classic 18 provinces within the Ming Dynasty of China, but that isn't exactly accurate. Let's look at what a Jesuit surveyor wrote in Italian after his mission to Guizhou. This land is called the Miaodi. Though located in the heart of the Chinese Empire, it is not under its governance. The Miao have their own princes, and the people here are stronger than the Chinese. They have different customs and languages. The land is mountainous, as are the 2 neighboring regions. In reality, Miaodi was just one of the many semi-autonomous regions in Guizhou, and chances are, even if the empire surveyors wanted to enter these areas, the local royalty could simply refuse, and the empire had no way of forcing entry. That's why the Jesuit described the islands as beyond the Qing control. Taiwan was no different. Attempting militant control over indigenous groups in the mountains would have been a logistical and financial nightmare. So, huge portions of lands outside the barbarian border were simply left blank. But just because a place was wiped out of the map doesn't mean it stayed that way forever. Territorial ownership changed all the time. By the mid-18th century, Taiwan's barbarian border started to shift inland, driven by continued expansion from the southern Fujianese settlers into the hill. From the 18th century onward, imperial policy toward indigenous territories grew more proactive. A series of maps documenting the earthen oxen border were drawn, and the most famous of which is the illustrated map of Taiwan's cultivated and restricted lands from the Qianlong era, better known as academically as the Purple Line map. But that's the story for another time.